Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We will begin with our prayer to be followed by the national anthem. May we request everyone to put yourselves in the presence of our Lord.
God Almighty, thank you for bringing us together to celebrate Cebuano culture and heritage through the sharing of our stories. We need this in this time of uncertainty, O God, to remind us of our identity as a people, unique, blessed, and proud. This reminder must inspire us that whatever challenges we face, whether unseen, alien, and treacherous, can always be overcome when we are united in working for the present and the future and the heritage of our children and community. We pray for our present day heroes who are fighting against the virus and other threats that besiege us today, our own people struggling to overcome these threats, and those who have died, fallen but never forgotten. Dearest God, heal our land. Amen.
Maayong hapon mga Sugbuanon. Welcome to the 5th at Gabi sa Kabilin 2020 online activities. This is an engaging space to appreciate and experience Cebu's culture and heritage. To formally start our activity this afternoon, we would like to introduce the overall chair of 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines celebration of the Archdiocese of Cebu, Father Mar Vincent Balili's opening remarks.
Maayong adlaw kanatong tanan. Last Saturday, September 26, marked 200 days before we will be commemorating the 500th year anniversary of the first Mass and first baptism in April 2021. There were already set plans for this year until next, but were waylaid because of the pandemic. We had to go back to the drawing board, so to speak, to revisit plans and adjust them and accommodate the digital, a strategy made more relevant because of quarantine. Thus, we moved the celebration to include 2022, so physical activities can be incorporated, and added the social media activities while we are in quarantine to predispose everyone to the big events in 2021. Last Saturday, September 26 too, we opened the said social media activities of the 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines in the Archdiocese of Cebu, with the first of the three-part series of online talk show with Archbishop Jose S. Palma. This afternoon, we give you the keynote address to our run of webinars, videos, and online talk shows to the end of March 2021. The Archdiocese is very pleased to have partnered with the Gabi sa Kabilin online activities, especially because, first, the GSK is one of the Cebu's biggest cultural events. Second, the Ramon Aboites Foundation Incorporated, which spearheads the heritage event, and some of its partner museums are partners too of the Archdiocese. And third, most of our activities are also aligned with theirs. The webinar this afternoon, The Impact of 500 Years of Christianity to Filipino Life and Culture, is very subject. Faith pervades and influences all aspects of life, from personal, cultural, social to political. I believe the subject should be of relevance and interest to us all. And we found the right person to discuss this topic to us. May I introduce our speaker? Specializing in the early Spanish colonial history of the Philippines, our speaker spent many years of graduate and postgraduate research in various archives in the Philippines and in Europe, particularly in Spain, Portugal, and Italy, where he also delivered lectures in prestigious gatherings of scholars, such as in one of Spain's oldest universities, the Universidad de Sevilla, and in the Sociedad de Geografía de Lisboa in Portugal, among others. As a prolific scholar, he published more than 30 books and over 100 monographs on various topics in local and national histories. And most important of these, Ferdinand Magellan Armada de Malloca and the European discovery of the Philippines, the first comprehensive and fully documented book on the subject written by a Filipino historian, earning him the recognition as one of the leading scholars on Magellan history. As the only Asian member of the multinational Comité Internacional of Sevilla 2019-2022 in Spain, spearheading the celebration of the 500 years of circumnavigation of the world, he is also one of the few Magellan historians in the world invited by the Spanish Ministry of Defense to meet King Philip VI of Spain and with the Admiral of the Spanish Navy. Appointed as one of the 5 members of the panel of experts by the National Quincentennial Commission, he is currently the director of the Partido Studies Center and the newly created Magellan-Elcano Studies Center at the Partido State University in Camarines Sur. Maigsuon o mga higala, it is my privilege to give you Dr. Danilo M. Gerona. Daghang salamat o maayong hapon natong tanan.
Thank you very much, Father Mar Vincent Balile, for that very, very generous introduction. And I would like to greet these ones and others are in this keynote lecture celebration of the 500 years of Christianization of the Philippines. I would also like to, of course, greet and thank the Archbishop Jose Palma for the invitation. The Ramon Boites Corporated, and this Gabi sa Kabiling group that is responsible for holding this webinar, and to all the others who have made this webinar a reality. And I know that they have been having series of lectures even earlier, and probably it will go on for some more days in preparation for the celebration of the Magellan celebration of the 500 years. Now, my talk will focus on the contribution of the Christianization of the Philippines for the last 500 years. So it's going to examine the impact of the process of Christianization that began in, of course, with the introduction of Christianity in 1521 by the Magellan expedition, and a sustained continuous process in 1565 until today. So there is, I think it's high time that in view of the celebration of the 500 years, we have to look back and re-examine what have we gained, and probably be thankful for the benefit of the faith and all the other benefits, all the other gifts that we have received other than our faith. So this brief lecture is actually a product of decades of my research as a historian, which deals with the early colonial period of the Philippines. I did much of my work in the various archives in the Philippines and Spain, in the ecclesiastical archives of the Augustinians in Valladolid, and the Franciscan archives, and the imperial archives in Archivo General de Indias. And of course, this is also a product of my work on the Magellan expedition, which of course we know that Cebu figures prominently in this particular historic moment in our country. So let me begin with this presentation. The Magellan expedition and the natives' introduction to Christianity. Of course, the coming of Magellan in 1521 signaled the end of the faith to the Filipinos. When I was working on the Magellan records, I was surprised to know that, contrary to what we have always known in our history, that there was only one priest who accompanied the Magellan expedition, Father Pedro Valderrama. There were actually 3 priests who came with the expedition. Unfortunately, only one survived it to arrive in the Philippines. That is Father Pedro Valderrama. And out of that, we have the first mass, celebrate the first mass and the first baptism. So the Magellan expedition, although it was not able to sustain its presence and therefore failed to lay down the groundwork for a sustained evangelization of the Philippines, nonetheless paved the way for the more sustained process of the introduction of our faith, and of course the systematic evangelization with the coming of the Legazpi expedition. The other thing that we are grateful with the Magellan expedition is because, as I have said, it was responsible for baptizing the first Christians in the islands. And not only that, there was the celebration of baptism with the chieftain of Cebu and his allied families, but it was also responsible for institutionalizing the sacrament of matrimony, and therefore abrogating the traditional polygamous system of the natives, because it endorses indirectly the system of monogamy in the Philippines. Because it was a tradition before that, of course, the chieftains before practice polygamy. They have concubinates, have many, many wives. And in fact, the power of the chieftain is generally according to the number of wives he had. But when Raja Humabon accepted the faith and have the wife baptized into the Catholic faith, it means to say that he is to give up the other wives he had. And for that reason, that was also marking the beginning of the monogamous system in the Philippines. The other gift, of course, of the Magellan expedition is, of course, the Santo Niño. Because of the expedition, we have started the devotion to the Santo Niño. Although, of course, we know that briefly after the death of Magellan, we do not really know what happened to it. But as our history unfolds, we know that with the coming of Legazpi in 1565, the Santo Niño still exists, and probably underneath the trappings of relapse to pre-colonial religion, some people still venerates the Santo Niño in a certain way that approximates Christianity. So can we now proceed to the next? The coming of the Legazpi expedition in 1565 sealed, of course, or I would say opened the door for the sustained work of evangelization. Evangelization is intimately tied with the work of conquest of the royal crown of Spain. There is a certain agreement we know, of course, any student of history would know of this idea of Patronato Real de las Indias. This is an arrangement that goes back prior to the coming of Magellan to the Philippines, and began in some way with the expansion of the Portuguese to the east. Crown will support for the missionaries, and the missionaries will provide the much needed work of conversion which Spain wanted to promote throughout the empire. And the Patronato Real de las Indias we cannot ignore the role of this in the understanding of our history. As we said, in the Patronato Real, it's the king as the royal patron provides the support to the missionaries, and the missionaries will be sent to the various parts of the empire in order to work not only for God but also for the king. So they have the Spanish phrase, in el servicio de ambas majestades, in the service of both majesties. Therefore, to understand the work of Christianization in the Philippines, we have to understand the workings of this Patronato Real. So, when the missionaries came to the Philippines, there was the primary goal, of course, is to bring about salvation to the natives. But they cannot divorce that obligation from the obligation also imposed upon them by the crown, by the King of Spain, that they have to bring also, in some way, the other obligations which the crown is obliged to bear to the people. That is the Hispanization, and of course also to raise the interest in some way of Spain in all her other territories. It does not mean to say that, of course, the missionaries wholeheartedly concurred to this obligation. The obligation, therefore, is simply to establish, maintain the colony, serve the king for not only for the interest, secular interest of the of Spain, but of course the most important is the salvation demand of bringing about salvation to the natives. But as I said, there are two features in the work of the Patronato Real. One is the missionaries pursued their primordial goal of bringing about salvation. The other would be the band of conquistadores who came to this particular territory of the empire and pursued the more secular interests of the Spanish crown. And along the way, we can understand that there would be certain problems that would crop up, which the missionaries would not, in a way, concurred with, such as the abuses committed by the conquistadors. The missionaries stood by the natives, protected them. In fact, most missionaries were assigned the title of Protector de las Indias. And that began way back in the Latin American experience when Bartolome de las Casas stood as the champions of the natives, and that was employed in all other expeditions, that at least a chaplain would accompany an expedition and he carries the designation of Protector de las Indias. Next. By the way, if you notice that, if you go back a little bit to that to that image, that image actually reflects the whole idea of the patorial. So on one side you will see a bishop with the missionaries, and on the other side you will see the Spanish soldiers and the king. And this is actually a graphic representation of the very idea of what the Patronato Real was. One of the concerns, of course, of the missionaries in the coming to the Philippines, of course, the most primordial of all is the conversion of the natives to the faith. But the missionaries realize that this is not an easy job. They have been exposed to their experiences in South America when many missionaries died along the way because of the refusal, the resistance of the natives to accept the faith. The same situation in some way was encountered by the missionaries in the Philippines, that they realized that they cannot easily convert the natives, even with persuasion. There is a need in some way to enforce certain measures upon the natives so that they would be able to effect the demand for the conversion of the natives. That's precisely the reason why they use the idea of a conquista. If we look at the title of these books, the title of this book, kindly enlarge that. No, the previous. It says here, Conquistas de las Islas Filipinas, la temporal e la espiritual. So in some way, these are books written in the early period of evangelization. Then there is another book. It says here, Historia General de Filipinas Conquistas Espirituales. So even the missionaries regarded the very idea of conversion with the need to conquer, the need not only to persuade, but the need to use certain pressure upon the natives so that they could effect a more sustained work and lasting work of conversion on the natives. So when they arrived in the Philippines, they realized that their enemy here are not actually the soldiers that they have always encountered in Europe. You have to understand that the idea of conquista in terms of conversion began right in their experience of the crusade. That the way to convert the people, the infidels of the Middle East, of the Holy Land, to retake the Holy Land, there is a need to use force, and then eventually bring about defeat to them. But that did not only end in the Holy Land. The idea of bringing about defeat with a certain use of force was also brought to the Iberian Peninsula when the so-called Reconquista, when the Spaniards and the Portuguese started reclaiming the territory that had been placed under the control of the Moors for the last 700 years. But when Columbus discovered America, Spain took upon them the mandate to bring the faith, to bring what they have won in the crusade and in the Reconquista to other territories, and that included the discovery of the Philippines, the demand to bring about the faith in the Philippines. But here they realize they are not going to encounter warriors or soldiers the way they did in the Holy Land. The enemies that they encountered here were the native priestesses. The vanguard of resistance does not lie in the warrior class. It lies in the religious practitioners, the babaylanes, the katulunans. And precisely, it was the need to conquer them. They need to suppress the rule of these priestesses so that it could pave the way for the instruction, for the conversion of the natives through more persuasive, less coercive method. But other than these native priestesses, the other obstacles were the chieftains. The reason is because the chieftain benefits from the privileges that they enjoyed. The perquisites of their power included the control of women, the profligate life of the native chiefs are responsible, or was responsible in some way, for the resistance that they offered to conversion. Many chronicas or historias written in the early part of the conversion would tell the willingness of the chieftains to be converted. But once they were told by the friars that they have to give up drunkenness, once they were told to give up womanizing or the profligate life of having concubines, many of them refused conversion. In fact, Fray Gaspar de San Agustin and the early chroniclers, early Augustinian missionaries, recalled the experience they had of two chieftains. One of them was a certain chieftain by the name of Katungay, and so another chieftain named Sumakyo, which was supposedly related to Raja Tupas. When all the chieftains had already accepted baptism, the two were willing to accept baptism, but when they were asked to give up their wives, and it says one of them had 2 wives, the other had 3 wives, said no. So that is the reason why there is a need for the missionaries to conquer, to make use of to employ the assistance of these conquistadores to bring about and pave the way for the more persuasive method of converting the natives' faith. But we have to understand also the nature of the Spaniards. The Spaniards, far from what we have always been taught and some we learned from our history, that they can simply enter a certain territory. Take, for example, the case of the battle between Magellan and Lapu-Lapu. One of the frequent questions asked to me, and some people would react and say, oh, Magellan was arbitrarily attacked Lapu-Lapu, and for that reason, it seems as if it's a very, very barbaric act on the Spaniards to simply get into the territory, command the people and say, okay, you have to pay that. But it appears that that is not how it works. So to understand our history, we have to understand also how the Spanish imperial regime and imperial system worked. The Spaniards were already, and I would say, one of the earliest people to understand the value of um, human rights. In fact, some people recognize Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish Dominican friar, was assigned in South America as among the early, you would say, fathers of human rights. And it was because of the works of Father de las Casas that certain reforms, even in the early part of the 16th century, in the age when Spain was sending so many conquering expeditions, the idea of protecting the natives' rights was actually born. So we have Francisco Victoria, we have Bartolome de las Casas, and in the Philippines, the very idea of de las Casas influenced even the minds of the first bishop of the Philippines, Fray Domingo de Salazar, also a Dominican. So the idea, what I'm trying to say here is, when the Spaniards came here, they were already equipped with certain moral principles on how they would treat the natives. They cannot simply attack a certain territory because the captain of the conquistadores did not like the behavior of the chieftain. Take, for example, Lapu-Lapu. The Spaniards, or Magellan for that matter, did not outright attack Lapu-Lapu. He sent a certain emissary and read or performed what they call the requerimiento. A requerimiento is an important principle of conquest among the Spaniards, meaning to saying, when a certain band of conquistadores enter a territory, they cannot simply fire their arquebuses or shoot the natives with their arrows. They have to perform this requerimiento. They have to tell the natives, if ever there are people there, they have to tell them that we are here because God, who has assigned our king to bring about the faith, so you have to submit yourselves to us. So unless you submit yourself to us, then we will raid your territory, will arrest you, will imprison you. So there is already a certain sort of a Miranda rights. There's a certain kind of a procedure in dealing with the native population. The other thing is, they cannot just engage in war. There is certain rule already well known to the conquistadores that they have to observe, the so-called buen guerra. The conquistadores cannot just wage war. There must be a just reason for waging war. And the only reason allowed for them to engage in war with the natives was because they refused to accept baptism. And that, in a way, explains to us why the conversion of the Philippines was paid by the idea of conquista. They have to employ force as provided, as allowed by the principle of buen guerra, only because they have to win the soul of these people. So, following the very principle of the Inquisition in place in Europe and in South America, which of course it was not implemented in the Philippines. The idea is, there is a need, if there is a need to suffer the body of the natives, if there's a need to inflict suffering on the body of the natives, it could be done because of higher purpose, to save their souls. And that idea of the Inquisition, in some way, although as I said, it was not implemented in the Philippines, works in the mind of the early missionaries, that they have to use force to bring about the greater good, the salvation of their soul. Okay. When the Spaniards and the Spanish missionaries came to the Philippines and began the work of conversion, once the road is paved and overcome the violent resistance or even the resistance of the native priestesses, which of course do not threaten the Spaniards by material force, but simply by the beliefs that they possess supernatural powers. The moment they have suppressed the practice, the supposedly idolatrous practices of the native priestesses, of the Babaylanes and the Catulunans, then the road for the conversion of the natives was open. The Spanish missionaries, in any archival documents and in any chronicas, you will encounter always the term reducción. And this, let me dwell a little bit to explain this in connection with the eventual work of bringing about the faith and the realization of their mandate, not only to convert the natives to Christianity, but also to bring about a more comprehensive transformation in the work of Hispanization. The reduction and the objectives of Christianization. As I said, there is a word, which is coming from the Spanish infinitive reducir. The 1611 dictionary, the Tesoro de la Lengua Castellana, says that the infinitive, the word reducir actually means to be convinced, can you go back? And to emerge into something better. So one thing is, reduction implies persuasion. The natives have to be persuaded. For what? For something good for them. So this time, the next step of Christianization is to persuade them. To persuade them to do the biddings of the missionaries because they were intended for something good. And in this work of reduction, it included processes. One is the work of evangelization. And I would say, these are not my own words. These are the words mentioned in the doctrinas, in the historias, in the chronicas of the various religious orders in the 16th, 17th, and even the 18th century. That the reduction was composed of three major features. Major features for the transformation, not only for conversion, but for the transformation of the native society. One of them is evangelization. The other is urbanization. And the other is civilization. Let me dwell a bit on this. Evangelization. Of course, we know the word would translate to English as evangelization. Sometimes they would say conversion, but it contains certain features. One of them, of course, is the need to preach the doctrines. The missionaries, it's of course the most primordial of all obligations for the natives, is to bring about the change of the religious worldview. From this idolatrous practice, the worships of the different god, the worship of Gugurang, the worship of Bathala, of Kanlaon, to the worship of God, of Christianity. But other than the conversion, this work of educating, teaching them the faith, which of course they do. First of all, in the convents, when they bring about the young boys to the convent, that they may live in a sort of a boarding school and learn not only about the faith, but also about the life of the Spanish, the life of the Spaniards. So to imbibe the culture of the Spaniards. But then, other than that, the more primordial effort of the missionaries, aside of course from the preaching of the faith, teaching them about the basic features about the faith of our faith. I think there's a certain. Can we proceed? Can you show them the Doctrina Christiana? Take for example this Doctrina. This is a cover of the 1593 Doctrina Christiana, which serves as the guide for the missionaries to inculcate the basic doctrines of the Catholic faith to them. From this first Tagalog version, it was translated to different major regional dialects in the Philippines. In fact, one here is, I think, this is a work of Father Mentrida. Father Mentrida was assigned in the Visayan region and did a lot of, wrote a lot of works on the faith and also on the language of the Visayans. But if you go back a little bit to this slide. Previous to that. One of the, I would say, I would like to emphasize on this because I would say these, aside from the faith that we have imbibed, this became sort of a cornerstone of the transformation of Philippine society. The rise of monogamy. As I said earlier, when Raja Humabon accepted the faith and himself baptized, the documents would say there that his wife, Juana, had many wives, many women attending to her. Although it was not clearly specified, there's a possibility among some historians would interpret that this could have been some of the wives of Raja Humabon. But the one who was identified as his wife was Queen Juana. And in that particular manner of accepting the faith through baptism, it was also a way of presenting his wife Juana as his legitimate wife. Because the condition of the missionaries, you have to forego with other wives. If you have to accept baptism, then the rest had to be foregone. The one that was baptized with you becomes your legitimate wife. And that is the reason why the baptism of Raja Humabon in some way paved the way for the rise of monogamy in the Philippines. When the monogamous marriage was accepted, became part of the culture of the Filipinos, it also paved the way for the rise of certain devotional and certain family values, such as the love of parents, the love of children, the respect for their lives, the respect for the elders. Why? Contrary to what we have always been familiar with, because I did much of my work for my doctorate on the sermones. I was shocked to know that friars would always complain that they would tell the young people said, oh, you don't respect your parents anymore. When they grow old, you simply ignore them. You leave them anywhere. You don't care for them. So the idea about love for our parents, it appears that it came to us through the birth of Christianity. The respect for life of the children. There were documents that say that children, those who have infirmities, those who have deformities, are actually allowed to die in the forest by the family, by the parents, because they became a burden when they grow old. When to take care of them would become a burden, so they simply kill them. In fact, in some regions, they say that there are families that practice the so-called primogeniture, that they only keep the eldest son alive, and some of the children were deliberately killed. So it sounds strange to us, but the early missionaries encountered them. But when Christianity, when the idea of a family was absorbed by the natives, all these things were eventually suppressed. The other thing that you have to understand is the family is something noble to the pre-Hispanic, to the natives of the Philippines. It that in the pre-colonial society, there was no idea of a family. They can live together, they can marry several, but the idea of a family as actually considering as one that preaches the sanctity of marrying one of wife and husband was apparently alien to the pre-colonial natives. That's precisely the reason, and for example, in the pre-colonial Bicol, they do not have a word that approximates the very meaning of the Spanish familia. The word pagaharong-harong, meaning to say, when people live in a house, then that's already the basic unit that they have. Were they married? How many wives were there? We don't really know. But the idea of a Christian family means that you have to be married and you have to only have one wife or one husband. So that's probably the reason why the Spaniards did not allow any native word to be used as a substitute to the family, to the Spanish familia, because it appears that there is no native word that fits exactly the meaning of the Spanish Catholic idea of familia. But again, as I said, that the moment the idea of a family took root and became institutionalized in the colonial society, the friars reinforced that by devotional practices, rebuilding and reinforcing family values. Among them, the devotion to Mary. The idea of Mary as the ideal mother. Not only that Mary is the ideal mother, her virginity becomes a model for the natives. In the pre-colonial Philippines, virginity does not matter. But Mary, when the family was institutionalized, Mary became the symbol of purity and is installed as the model for women to imitate. They also introduced the devotion to Saint Joseph, to the Holy Family, and to the Santo Niño, of course. All these objects of devotions are intended to reinforce the sacredness of the family in the life of the natives. But other than that, the Spanish missionaries did not ram into the minds of the natives these doctrines of Christianity. It's not a one-way transaction when the friars have to simply teach the natives about the faith, about Christian morality, but they also exerted effort in order to understand how the natives look at the world, so that the friars, the missionaries, would be able to inculcate these Western values, these Western ideas, this new faith to the natives in a way that the natives would be able to appreciate them, in the way that the natives would be able to understand them. And that is why there is a need, the need for the there is a need for them to understand the minds of the natives. And that is the reason why a number of missionaries compiled, wrote down their observations of the practices of the natives, their pre-colonial culture, married life, their, their, their belief system, and all these things, so that the friars would be able to inculcate these Christian ideals, in the sense that the natives themselves would understand them, would imbibe them, and would make an assent on the basis of their understanding. So, can we go back a bit to... So, the other thing is the need for language. The Spanish missionaries, as we said, did not only hammered into the minds of the natives the doctrines of the faith. They also have to study how to articulate that faith in the language of the natives. And in fact, when the first batch of Augustinians arrived in Cebu, it is said that Fray Martin de Rada began compiling a sort of a vocabulary, so that they would be able to efficiently communicate with the natives in their own tongue, so that they would be able to contextualize in the nuances of the natives the very ideas of Catholicism. And because of this, the Spanish missionaries produced vocabularies. Aside from Doctrina Christiana, they also come up with linguistic tools, these dictionaries, these artes, these grammar books. And in a way, the benefit of that for the present generation is because of these works of the early missionaries, they preserve the native languages. They preserve the culture of the natives based on their writings. And we know how the natives of the Philippines lived before the coming of the Spaniards, because of the works of these missionaries in their efforts to contextualize the ideals, the ideas of Catholicism. But then it was not an easy task. As I've said, if earlier on there were resistance, even after they accepted the faith, there were also occasional outbreaks of relapse to the pre-colonial practices. For example, as late as 1684, the archival documents in Seville contained very, very interesting stories of this event in the southern Tagalog region. Despite the fact that the area in Laguna had been converted to Catholicism, and the natives were practicing the faith outwardly, apparently. They go to church regularly, they listen to catechism classes, but during certain parts of the months, they practiced their seasonal, let's say, idolatrous rituals, as they go to certain caves. And it is said, the documents clear about this thing, they apparently was worshipping a large serpent. So it's a relapse. It's an indication that that the natives went back to the pre-colonial practice. And when the friars started asking them, why did you relapse? They would say, well, because our parish priests failed to attend to us, because there were encounters of abuses, and because they were not actually comfortable with certain practices of the faith. So this implies to the missionaries, especially to Dominicans, that there is a need to expound more the faith. That when there was a certain realization that the people accepted the faith without fully understanding the substance faith that is that they have embraced. So there is a need to bring in more catechism classes, teach them more. And this, as I was saying, the main accomplishment and the early stage of evangelization is because they bring us the faith, but alongside with the conversion to Catholicism, to Christianity, came also certain practical implications in our culture as a Filipinos, that it preserved our regional languages and enable us to contextualize our faith today, our culture today, by way of understanding our own pre-colonial practices that have been embodied in the works of the missionaries. We proceed. The other feature is these are examples of the vocabulario, especially those are the works of Father Mentrida and Father Francisco Encina. All of them are, of course, written for the Visayans. The other feature of the reduction was the urbanización. The Spanish missionaries realized that the pre-colonial Filipinos were living in scattered in sparsely inhabited territories, remotely located along river banks, slopes of the mountains, and even right in the fringes of the forest. So the Spanish missionaries realized very difficult to effect a comprehensive and immediate transformation and even conversion to the faith if you are confronted with such sprawling territory where various settlements exist and even relocated, with only few missionaries carry out the conversion and the work of transformation. So there is a need to bring about an urban community. There is a need to draw them together, to assemble them, and draw them together and form a community. So one of the first works of the missionaries, aside from the inculcation of the Catholic faith, the work of spiritual conversion was also the work of converting the natives into a more sociable beings, that they have to live way beyond the small world that they were in, the baranganic world. So you have to gather them together and bring them in a certain location, strategic location, so that they can dwell in a more convenient, more accessible to other missionaries to go and regularly bring about their indoctrination. So there is a need to resettle them and build a community, an urban community. And when the Spanish missionaries started building such community, they introduced what they call the so-called typical kind of a settlement, which is far cry from what they have always known before, that they can build anywhere near the river banks or the forest. They have to choose, the missionaries chose a particular place where an urban community could thrive and they have this pattern known as the Cabecera Visita complex, from whence our modern towns evolved. Here, the Cabecera, the town, the geo-administrative unit was divided into two components: the Cabecera, which is the center of the settlement, and the outlying barrios known as the Visita. Visita because they were only occasionally visited by the parish priest who was residing in the Cabecera, which is the head settlement. So here, the Cabecera, in the Cabecera, you find the plaza and the major ecclesiastical complex, and also the other features of the colonial regime, the municipal buildings, the primary schools, of course, the church, the cemetery, and the central space known as the plaza, or what we now call the plaza complex. So they also introduced the Western construction. They introduced materials, concrete materials, to build these massive structures and patterned after the European design. So here, the idea of modern buildings and of modern towns evolved as part of the process of urbanization, as an integral feature of the reduction. They also, because of the growing number, the expansion in the number of residents, need also on the part of the missionaries to address this need for subsistence of the expanding pueblo. So the missionaries did not only allow the natives to do what they have been doing before to earn their living, farming, fishing, hunting, but they introduce certain novelties in terms of industries. For example, in Bicol, the Franciscan friar Espaillargas invented a certain knife which the natives used to strip abaca, and eventually paved the way for the commercial value of abaca as a major export product of the Philippines. Cacao was brought to us from Acapulco. It was brought by a certain brother of a secular priest in Camarines Sur, but then it was stolen by an enterprising native from southern Tagalog, and there it grew, eventually becoming a major commodity in the southern Tagalog region. The tobacco was part of another industries that evolved in the Spanish colonial regime, and it became a major export commodities of the Philippines. These again are another significant contribution of the missionaries. They did not only preach the doctrine, but they created communities from where our modern towns evolved. They also brought about industries from where the late 19th century Philippines depended for their economic subsistence in the colony. The other thing, I'll give you an example of the result of their effort to urbanize the natives. Here is a good example of that successful work of urbanization in Cebu itself. This is a 1699 map which shows to us the center of the Spanish city of Santissimo Nombre de Jesus. Well-organized, well-planned settlement, and started in 1565, and of course, it remained as such throughout the centuries. And this is because of the pioneering works of the Augustinians, which implemented the reduction, and this one important feature was this urbanization. And this is the result of that. And the other is, just to give you another another classic example of this reduction, how towns were built by the missionaries, was this town of Quiapo in 1746. It gave you an idea about church, right in the middle of the settlements. You have here these arranged, very much orderly streets The so-called grid pattern is characterized the Cabecera complex. Again, these are example of the successful effort to bring about order in the settlements that the missionaries had created. The works of urbanization also, as I said, brought us the Western concept of architecture. A good example of that is the 1718 plan of the Cebu Cathedral, and from whence later on the recent modern buildings evolved. So they did not only build ecclesiastical structures, they also built military structures, such as that of the Fort San Pedro. This is from the map and from the certain plan drawn by Governor General Valdez Tamon in the early 18th century. So again, massive structures, and these materials were introduced to us. The use of marble, the use of lime, were all results of the efforts of the missionaries to realize the other component of the reduction, the urbanization. The third and the ultimate feature of the reduction is the process of civilization, to bring about civilization. The Spanish missionaries, of course, were confronted, as I said, by natives who had varying response to the work of conversion. Some easily submitted, but others resisted. So the missionaries classified them into two. There were those who were dociles, the docile, those who were tame. But there were also those who were feroces, ferocious, fierce, like animals. And the missionaries therefore regarded them as like brutes. And they in fact invented a number of words to describe their characteristics. They were malvados, which means to say they are bad people, infieles, unfaithful, apostatas, apostates, because some of these people were already converted to the faith, but they were disloyal to the faith. They gave up the faith and they became apostates. There were those who are vagamundos, people who refuse to live in the urban settlement. They are enemies of civilization because they refuse the evangelization. They refuse the urbanization. They refuse the civilization. So that's in fact the very words itself. All these other terms captured in varying way the idea of who is civilized. The one who refused evangelization. The one who refused urbanization. So they were also called Monteses, people who refused to be brought to the mainstream of civilization in the urban settlement, and they loved the freedom of the mountains. They were called remontados, those who have already climbed, those who have already went down and climbed again. They were also called cimarrones, wild bulls, because they could not be tamed. They do not accept these ideals that the missionaries wanted to bring about: conversion, cultural transformation by way of urbanization, and of course, bring about civilization. On the other hand, there were those who were dociles, tame, and these are the people who the missionaries have trained, educated. They were in fact they were called either criados, The word criados means you are a servant, or it could also mean that you are brought up by them. So these are the people who accepted the Spanish missionaries, accepted the faith, and also allowed themselves to be trained, allowed themselves to grow up in the culture by the Spaniards. They were eventually called Ladinos, meaning to say the more precocious ones. And for them, it shows that if you accepted the culture of Spain, the culture being brokered by the missionaries, then you are precocious, you are enlightened, you are educated. As an incentive to them, those who were allowed to be trained, those who became criados, those who became Ladinos, they were given importance by the Spanish, the missionaries in the colonial regime. The Ladinos became the first teachers. And those Ladinos mostly eventually assumed the status of principales. They became the elites of the native society. In a way, these are efforts to motivate them, to bring them into the mainstream of Spanish culture, to the mainstream of civilization, to bring them into the fold of the law and of the faith. And to end this, the missionaries, all this effort of the missionaries to educate them, initially by bringing about the science of the West, as Father Derrada did, as Father Ordaneta did, and the other host of missionaries, which in varying ways introduce certain features of Western culture, either in the area of mathematics, in the area of navigation, in the area of astronomy, in agriculture, in engineering. All these sporadic features of Western culture have been eventually consolidated in the form of schools. It's the missionaries who started laying the foundation of a sustained, systematic process of instruction, from where we have the primary schools and eventually the institutions of higher learning that gave way to the early universities, such as that of the Colegio de San Ignacio, the Colegio de San Jose, and the Universidad de Santo Tomas. Hence, what did Christianity bring to the natives? First, it brought to the natives hope, hope for the afterlife, in the form of Catholicism, which eventually evolved into which eventually, in some way, became the groundwork for other denominations that eventually sprouted in the course of our history. But other than the faith, it also brought about the basic social structure of the Philippine society, the family. And a family is a lasting institution, which began with the coming of the first missionaries, the baptism of Raja Humabon, and endures until the present. The morals which surround the very nature of the family, it endures until the present. The love of children, the love of parents, the respect for elders, the love for life, the respect for life. These are the values that evolved in the course of the rise of and the introduction of the notion of family to the Filipinos. So the family became the fundamental, the structural basis, I would say, of the Philippine society. Secondly, the introduction, by way of the reduction, the introduction of urbanization, the urban community, the town, the pueblo, became the very basis of our present community life in the modern times. This value of sociability, this value of social interaction, openness to other culture evolved out of this basic unit of the family, of the society. So if the family became the basic structure of the society, the town became of the socio-political organization of the Philippines. Finally, the idea of civilization. It's part of the work of Christianization, the effort to bring about civilization means that the natives must be open. So the very notion of civilization is openness. Earlier on, the pre-colonial villages were always suspicious of others. So internecine war happened. Although the villages were close to each other by several kilometers, frequent war erupted. But with the coming of the missionaries, the need to open themselves to others, to other culture, to others, other way of living. That is the fundamental basis of civilization. And the schools evolved as a system, as an institution, where sustained process of education, of learning, which are not only confined to those that are found, the ideas that are found in the locality, but also to those that are found beyond their confines. In the 16th century, it means the world means the Spanish Empire. The world means Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Americas. Today, we talk of the universal civilization. Beyond the confines of the Philippines, beyond the confines of Europe. And I think these are the three major contributions, lasting contributions of Christianization to the life of the Filipinos in the modern times. And looking forward to the celebration of the 500 years of Christianity with gratitude to God, the missionaries who laid their lives to bring about the conversion and the transformation of the Philippine society that we now enjoy today.
All right. Good afternoon, Dr. Gerona. Thank you very much for the very enlightening talk this afternoon. I know it's quite challenging for us both because here in Cebu it's about to rain, and usually when it rains, Camarines, you've been experiencing power failures at saka definitely kung mawawala ang power, walang internet connection. Yeah. I think, sir, you're on mute. Is he
Yeah,
on mute?
I do have a very poor
Correct.
connection.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we're glad to see you here. We're still here for the Q&A. I really like the presentation you made, sir, because you really focused on, you used this word actually at the start of your presentation, the gift of Christianity. It's also a gift. If you look at it, and based on what you have presented this afternoon, Christianity is really a gift based on the three things you mentioned: evangelization, urbanization, and civilization. Okay, but we're here to answer some questions. Do we have questions? Do we have questions? Okay, sir, you're back. We have a question here from Mon Estrada. Thank you very much for your question. He says, "Good afternoon, po, Sir Danny. My question is, how do we situate and resolve
Yes, yes,
the
I.
undying?" Sorry. Okay. Good afternoon po, Sir Danny. Let me repeat. My question is, how do we situate and resolve the undying tension between the dogmatic teaching of Catholic Christianity and the persistence and resurgence of subjugated knowledge of Philippine colonial shamanic religion?
Yeah.
Do you see the question, sir? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I got the question. Hello,
Yes, sir.
yeah.
How do
Um,
we resolve the tension daw ng the teachings of the church, and then yung
yeah,
parang persistence of the and the resurgence now of subjugated knowledge in pre-colonial times, especially the
yeah,
shamanic religion daw.
yeah. We have to understand. One thing is, thanks for the question, Mon. One thing is, you have to understand that, of course, the church, the structure, an institution. So even in matters pertaining to the dogma, this is not something that is simply made by an individual person or simply a product of an evolving culture. It's a product of deliberate decisions made under a particular organization and institutional decisions. So, what about the Filipino continuing cultural practices embedded in the Catholic Church itself? So, of course, what I think Monistrada is talking about is there are certain practices that may not be that are actually may not be in fact part of the dogma of the church, practices that are actually result of the natives or the people's interpretation of their own way of looking at religion. So and sometimes they may not be consistent with each other, but the problem is sometimes they can be diametrically opposed to with each other. So, for example, the beliefs in powers other than what had been accepted, what had been taught to us by the church. For example, believes in aswang, they believes in supernatural spirits. How do we reconcile such kind of practice that have been embedded to us? For example, I think Father Bulata once said that the Catholics would sign of the cross, but when they threw water outside their house, they would say, "Oh, tabi apo sa
Sabi,
Bicol." So, excuse me. So
that's also the same
essentially,
here, sir.
so it's actually embedded. These perspectives are embedded in our own practice as Catholics, as Christians, and sometimes they may not be consistent with the established or with the very teachings as part of the dogma of the Catholics. How do we arrive at a certain kind of a harmony between these two? Because for centuries this had always been the problem. We always speak of syncretism in our belief system. So we also speak of folk Catholicism. So how do we go about these things? Can we maintain, for example, a more tolerant attitude towards the natives, which may be performing certain rituals which are not consistent with the dogma of the Catholic Church, or should we stamp it outright and therefore be very very strict, assume a more inquisitorial attitude, the attitude, for example, of the inquisitional attitude? So if that's also the problem of the church, because the moment you become very 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 strict in this particular, people will probably leave the church. And I think what the mission, what the what the Jesuit missionaries, for example, to cite a certain case, in the 16th century, the Jesuit missionaries, uh, they attempted to, in a way, accept certain belief system of the natives as long as they do not conflict with the established dogma of the Catholic Church. For example, Father Juan Delgado in Historia Sacro Profana would allow, for example, certain beliefs in native practices in terms of healing, although many other religious orders proscribe them being part of the practices of the pre-Hispanic priests. So in some way, that's probably how we have to go about these things. It's still going to be a long process. So there is a certain, as I said, there is a certain dilemma. Should we stamp out these practices which are not in conformity with the doctrine of the Catholic Church, with the dogma, with established beliefs of the Church, or should we continue to allow them as part of the externalization of the simple faith of the natives, as part of their Catholic practices, which exist hand in hand with their indigenous worldview? I think it took 500 years to refine our Catholic faith, but I think it will continue to be so. It's a struggle that probably the priest, the Catholic Church has to go through. But I think as what the early missionaries did, it's not only a matter of doctrinal concerns. It's also a matter of civilizational issues, cultural issues. That the way to inculcate the faith does not exist only in a single perspective, that is in a single intention of simply converting.
I think we have been cut off. Sir Danny? Is Sir Danny still around? Anyway, Sir Danny was saying about how along the way, if I'm not mistaken, how along the way in 500 years of being Christianized, that there are also, how do you call this, some flexibility in a sense, no? A little bit of adaptability that the the missionaries had to entertain or to do, because to accommodate, because it's not easily the pre-colonial notions or the things that our ancestors knew before cannot easily be stamped out, and they have their own way of expressing their own faith. I hope I got that right, Sir Danny. Okay, while we're waiting for Sir Danny, I think he was cut off. He was already saying before that his connection was quite tricky already at the start of the webinar. We apologize for that. These are things that are beyond our control. Sir Danny po is in Camarines Sur. That is why we really had to get him as the keynote speaker, because and quite far. We had to get him from all the way from Camarines, is because he himself is one of the few people who are studying, are looking, or have been into the scholarship of early colonial Philippines. So, sir, you're back. You were saying, sir, about a little bit of, parang you said something about the civilizing factor, parang the humane factor of that the missionaries had to do in the 500 years work of evangelization. Sir Danny?
Hello.
Yes, I think you can be heard, sir.
Hello.
Yes. I'm glad
Hello,
you're
hi.
back, sir. Yes, sir.
Hi, just choppy.
Oh, sorry.
So
But you're fine,
yeah.
sir. We can hear you. You can just finish what you were saying, sir, before you were cut off. Sir, please continue.
Pardon?
Please continue. Go ahead, sir.
Parting words, Hides.
Di pa po. You were finishing pa po yung answer sa first question.
It was not, ano?
It
hides.
was not, yeah, it was, you were cut off, sir. Na-cut
Yeah.
off po kayo. Yeah.
So yeah, as I was saying, that is always been the concern, in a way, the dilemma of the Catholic Church, even among the early missionaries. For how would they, for example, respond to the native beliefs? Of course, they suppressed the rule of the native priestesses, the what they call the idolatria, the practice of idolatria. But then there are certain submerged practices that have been embedded in the rituals and the beliefs of the Catholic Church, which in a way do not conform to the to the strict uh, um, dogma of the Catholic Church. In a way, strictly speaking, they are in a way would be inconsistent and uh, an object of suspicion of being heretical, so to speak. So how would the church respond to that particular case? Immediately, as I was looking at the numerous documents and sermones in Spain, the attitude of many of the church authorities is to, in a way, allow a certain degree of tolerance. In fact, the church authorities, the priors, regard the Filipinos as spiritual infants. The reason for that, why is it that they allow certain kind of a tolerance for their sort of heretical practices, is because of the fact that, unlike in South America, where the Inquisition was established and therefore strictly required the natives to strictly conform, to toe the line of the dogma of the church, in the Philippines, by the way, the justification why they were quite strict in South America is because they realized that in South America, they already have civilization long before the coming of the Spaniards. In fact, some Spanish writers were saying that the civilization at the time in South America was far, far better than, in fact, the civilization that they knew in even in terms of urbanization that they knew in Spain. So, meaning to say, they recognized that the people of America were more civilized than the Indians of the Philippines. So when they came to the Philippines, they became more tolerant to the, considering the cultural level of the natives here. So they consider them as spiritual infants, as compared to the South Americans, who are spiritually matured because of their sophisticated level of civilization. And for that reason, as I said, they allowed certain room for these heresies, for these practices, which may not be directly in consonance with the dogma of the Catholic Church. But then they are tolerant as long as they do not diametrically oppose they are not diametrically in opposition to the dogma of the Catholic Church. For example, when they, for example, they allowed certain rituals such as the Passion. A good example of that is the Passion. Many people thought that the Passion is actually
Dr. Gerona has once again cut off. All right. I think we have to shift to a phone patch. Can we quickly shift to phone patch? Because we also are losing time. We would like to already close or begin to close our program. Sir, you've been cut off, but
okay.
thank you. I think that was clear already for us that the missionaries also practiced religious tolerance at the time, and even until now, you mentioned that even until now, there is still the continuous work of ano, parang stream refining our Christianity up to today. In fact, meron tayong tinatawag ngayon na popular religiosity or
Yeah,
popular
yeah.
piety. Yeah. Okay, sir. Thank you for that. Very elaborate answer, actually. Let's go to our next question. Kindly please flash from Ed Ibanez. In your opinion, what is the best gain into our Philippine culture except of course for the faith, the Christianization of our country, that we will be celebrating the 500 years in 2021. I think he's asking, sir, aside from the faith, ano ang mga magagandang mga gains or mga benefits na nakuha natin that we should also be celebrating in this 2021 in the 500 years? Thank you, Eddie Banias, for your question.
Yeah.
Sige po, sir.
Yeah. Okay. One thing is, aside from, of course, from the faith itself, as we said, the lasting, the durable, the enduring legacies of the Filipinos coming from what historians would call as the Hispanic Catholicism, the Catholicism that we obtained from the evangelization of the Spaniards in the Philippines. Actually, one of that, as I already emphasized, is the formation of the family. As I said, take for example, you will never find in any part of the Philippines a word that approximates the very notion of the Spanish familia. We use in every regions in the Philippines the Spanish familia, but never the Tagalog, the Visayan word for which would approximate the family. For example, somebody said mag-anak, but that's not familia is different from kamag-anak or mag-anak, mag-aanak. Apparently, there is no any word in any Philippine language that captures the very essence of the family. Because the family does not only mean members of the family, the mother, the children. It does not only mean the group that they have, the place where they reside, but the family is more than simply the physical presence of the people in that particular unit of our society. The family involves relationship. The family involves this very notion, the sacrament of matrimony. You cannot have a family unless you are married. It involves the two persons, a man and a woman. It's not just two persons living together, man and man, woman and woman. That's not the notion of the Spanish concept of the family. It must be what they call natural, man and woman procreating, having children, but it's not for that. They must have a certain relationship bound by the church through marriage, and at the same time, a certain moral relationship that pervades within that particular unit and within the very persons who constitute the family. For example, filial love. This, for example, parental love in some way. These are constitutive of the notion of a family. So you do not just, in the pre-colonial Philippines, for example, in Bicol region, they have no word that approximates the Spanish familia. They refer to as basic unit in the pre-colonial Bicol as pagaharong-harong, meaning to say, when people join together, they build their own house, that becomes the basic unit of the society. But
Sir,
not
I have a kind of like a question, and correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it also Asians particularly are known also to to have those family ties? So hindi ba yan parang contrary to the kind of values we had when during the pre-colonial period po?
choppy hide, sorry, it's very, very
Ah,
choppy.
no, I was just I found it surprising, and correct me if I'm wrong po, sir. Kasi 'di ba Asians are said to have close family ties. It's surprising
Yeah.
lang na hindi yan present sa pre-colonial Philippines.
In the pre-colonial Philippines, you do not have a family. That is the reason why the church was very, very strict on that. When you have to remember that you have to think in a different way. Not the kind of family that we understand today. In the pre-colonial Philippines, people can live together without the blessings of a certain ritual. people can live together. There's a certain public ritual, but not necessarily a religious ritual that bound them together the way we understand it today in church marriage. In the
So you're the
pre-colonial society,
yeah, sorry. The definition you're referring to, of course, sir, is the definition of the Catholic Church
yeah,
of
yeah,
what a family is, what constitutes. And I like that, sir, because you emphasize that in the definition, uh, included in that is the relationship. Parang very important yan na term sa Catholic understanding that we have a relationship with each other, we also have a relationship with God, and that makes us a family.
yeah. I think as I got it right. The idea there is the relationship that exists there. It's not, one does not build a family only because of marriage. Of course, in the pre-colonial society, I said, they may not have any marriage. There were marriage rituals, but mainly the rituals are only for the elite. But mainly for the ordinary people, you hardly encounter them. But but in terms of that particular marriage, okay, the moment a certain bond exists because of a certain public ritual, or even probably granted a certain religious ritual performed by the katulunan or by the babaylan,
Babaylan.
yeah, but it does not. It the idea of bond ends there, because the moment they did not agree with each other, they can have a divorce. But in the idea of the Spanish familia, that's not it. They have to sustain a certain relation that must go into this, even the relationship of the children itself. And it, in fact, develop out of this bond must have certain moral values that must sustain this particular relationship. So, uh, you don't just speak of a family because there is a certain ceremony performed. It's the struggle of the friars precisely that for centuries they have to maintain this particular presence of the family. I was amazed, in fact, because I know very well this, because I did much of my work for my doctorate on this particular notion. The friars will always will make sure, for example, the marriage bans. Why is it that today even the church today is strict on marriage bans? Because in the early Spanish colonial era, apparently the men, after they married in the town, would go to another town and marry another woman. So that's the reason why the prior would do, when someone is going to marry, he would announce that to the public, so that somebody would say, "Oh, I know that guy.
Yeah.
He's married in another town." Apparently, this is a problem that the priors had to struggle with. Because what's the problem? What's the reason there hides? The reason is because having more women in the colonial society was actually a perquisite of power. He who has more women is regarded as more powerful. When the church suppressed that, what happened to the elite? They could no longer have marriage. They can no longer have more women other than the single woman that they have. What they did is actually to engage in extramarital affairs.
Yeah.
That's why you look at the parish records, you will notice there in the baptismal records the name of the woman, but the man is not mentioned. It says there, so padre no conocido. And you will be surprised, because some 1700s, early 1800s, there are so many illegitimos. And in my study, most of those were fathered by the elite of the towns, because
Very
they were
interesting, sir.
having more wives as an emblem of power. And the church have to struggled with that. That's the reason why Hides, by 1849, Governor General Narciso Claveria had to make a decree that since then, family would adopt the surname of the father. That's in 1849. That sealed the very notion of the family as an institution in the Philippines.
That's very interesting and wonderful to know, sir. You have even the backings of history to prove uh, uh, having a concubine or mistresses are actually was a sort of like a masochistic source of power. Parang
That's true.
men find it, yeah.
That's true. But you have to understand, Hides, why is it so? Because you might condemn them as very, very immoral. They engage in such kind of. You have to understand that they in a different world with a different morals. For example, just I don't know, it might shock many Cebuanos. Don't you know that Tupas, the son, was the alleged son of Humabon, was not actually the son of Humabon. Tupas was actually the son of the brother of Humabon. But he became a sort of a son because Tupas, the nephew therefore of Humabon, married the daughter of Humabon. So
Hmm.
incestuous practices. But
Yes,
they live in a different world. So
different world.
what about men at the time marrying, having so many women? You have to understand that it has a material benefit. The material benefit is this: if would have more women, I would have more allies. The family of the woman I married become my ally. And the more women I have, the more children I would have. And the more children I would have, it means that I would have more labor pool.
Correct,
I would
correct.
have more warriors. In the
Yes.
pre-colonial Philippines, there are no hired warriors. The number of warriors you have depends on the number of families you have.
But I'd like
So,
to emphasize, sir, on that was another time. This is another time.
yeah,
Parang iba na nga yung time ngayon. So definitely does not work the kind of the setup, the system before. Iba na ngayon. So parang uh, especially ngayon lumabas na yung mga women empowerment, ganun sir.
that's true.
So
That's true.
so it does not work anymore. But anyway, sir, we have room for one more question. Let's have the last question, please, before we let go of Sir Rona, Sir Danny. From IAT Philippines, thank you very much for the question. And why, sir? Which one is it? Okay, this one. How do we rebut or debunk these hearsays from the Protestants that Filipinos became Christians through the use of violence, not the sacrament of baptism? Is Sir Danny still around, or has he been cut off again?
Okay, okay, Hides. Okay.
Yeah, you got the
Uh,
question. Yes, sir. Sige, sir.
yeah. Um, One thing you have to understand is, of course, I think it's understandable that that Christianity or the Catholic Church, in some way, had always been accused of using violence in terms of position. In fact, they would say imposition of the Catholic faith. It's not so much about persuading the people, but imposing the faith. That's generally accusation. But then you have to understand that in the context of the times. As I said earlier, in the early stage of Christianization, the church allowed certain degree of force. That's why they have a term for that historically.
The word entradas. Entradas is when a certain group, led by the missionary, entered a particular territory accompanied by soldiers. But why? Why do they have to accompany themselves? Because was that allowed by the king, by the church? Yes, it's allowed by the church, even by the papacy. The reason is this, and I think people should understand this, so that they'd be able to understand the dynamics of conversion, so that they would be able to appreciate our our faith today. The reason why they allowed soldiers and a certain degree of force is because of the fact that they have a doctrine known as the Buen Guerra. I was tell, as I said earlier in my lecture, that when the Spaniards came to the Philippines, they were already equipped with a very, very sophisticated moral and political theories. Remember, I told you we have Fray Bartolome de las Casas, in fact, considered as among the leading fathers of human rights. And when they came here, as I said, they were equipped with these particular principles. And what is the reason why they allowed force? One of the principles they have is the so-called Buen Guerra. Buen Guerra means that you can only engage in war You can only engage in war if it concerns the conversion to the faith. Other than that, it must go through certain processes. Meaning to say, why do you have to engage in war? Because the spirit, the soul of the person is important, more important than his body. That, of course, re-echoes the principle of the Inquisition. Why is it that the Inquisition, the Catholic Church has been condemned of using force in the Inquisition? Because the principle at the time of the church is this: it's better for the body to suffer than for the soul to suffer.
Yeah. Sir Danny? Okay. I think that is our cue, but I think Sir Danny was able to answer that last question, no? Hopefully it has something to do with why the reason why there was the use of force
That's right.
in converting uh, a person to the faith. And it,
That's right.
although it is, although Sir Danny ha, parang may ironic
Yeah.
ito kasi for the soul you use force, parang you for the body, no, you sort of like kill someone, you end up killing someone, but it's really because of the good of the person's soul. Yeah. Okay. Sir, hindi ka maririnig. Sorry. Let's just have this last words ni Sir Danny before we close our Q&A. Sir Danny?
Yes, hides. So,
Yes, sir.
yeah, yeah. But
Sir,
as I
pwede
was
na
telling,
kuha na lang yung camera. Oo. Baka,
Yeah,
sige sir.
but as I was telling you, you hide the idea of using force was actually only in the early stage of the conversion, when the missionaries were treading in a certain territory that had not been converted. They're not yet friendly. They are not even they are not yet assured of the friendly reception to them. So they have to be accompanied by soldiers, and if ever in some way it threatened the life of the missionaries, and if the people would not accept the faith, despite the fact that they have been told to them that you have to, because again, another issue there, is the missionaries would always tell them, that okay, you have to accept our faith or else we have to resort to force. That is what they call requerimiento. There's a certain ritual that they but then in the second part, when people have already, let's say, yielded the use of force, when they have already extirpated the presence of the Catulunans and the Babaylans, the native priestesses, they now approach it in a more friendly way. They begin, that's the reason why by the 1600s, many of the missionaries started compiling the cultures of the natives so that they will be able to approach the teaching of the Catholic faith in a more persuasive way rather than in a more coercive way. Second, they already started compiling the vocabulary of the natives so that they can establish rapport with the natives in their own respective language. So it's the idea of force had already been reduced to a certain degree. They have been already, it's now the persuasive element that dominates rather than the employment of force on the part of the missionaries in dealing with the natives conversion.
Yes. And with that, sir, parang maybe I would just like to close yung Q&A natin na parang it's very important that when we say there's the word faith, or even we say we say something about faith, it has to have an impact talaga on the life, the culture, the lifestyle of a
That's right.
person. So definitely the acceptance of a faith means that what the acceptance of the culture, the lifestyle change perhaps that would be required of the faith. And I think that's where we should focus also about this gift that is called the Christianity, because we're celebrating 500 years of Christianity. The many wonderful and beautiful things that were brought about by this faith to our lives. I love it when you said, sir, that we are able now to change our mindset, or parang worldview of life, that we now look at the afterlife. It's not just this life that we have here in this world.
Yeah.
And the love for the family, very wonderful, because that's something that the church has always been espousing. um, uh, the idea of taking care of our elders, the idea of taking care of our children. And I now, in a sense, understand also, sir, why we are a country in love with the Virgin Mother, because yun nga, she's the ideal mother. And parang in a sense it touch based on us, kasi parang our culture is also parang underground na maternal, eh, no? Although we say it's patriarchal, may parang pang hint of the maternal din. So that's, I think, is the reason why we fallen in love with the Virgin Mother. But there's so many things, sir, and we are also going to be thankful, should be thankful to the Spaniards, because they also documented our pre-colonial practices and culture before. And without them, wala tayong knowledge sa what we were like before. And with this, sir, we'd like to thank you very much for taking time. I know it has been a challenging afternoon with our connections. And with
That's
that, we'd like to, from Gabi sa Kabilin, sir, although we will be sending this to you, we'd like to show you our certificate of appreciation. Can we flash the certificate of appreciation given to Dr. Danilo M. Gerona for sharing his expertise and time as resource speaker of the webinar, The Impact of 500 Years of Christianity to Filipino Life and Culture during the Gabi sa Kabilin online activity for October, actually, and given this 2nd of October 2020 at Casa Gordo Museum here in Cebu City. And it's signed by our President and CEO of RAFI, Miss Dominica Bichua. And I believe, sir, you will be getting also something from the side of the Catholic Church here, the Archdiocese of Cebu, who is spearheading also this social media activity. Thank you very much, Sir Danny, for taking time. And I know you have a very hectic schedule. Sunod-sunod yung lectures mo. Thank you, sir.
very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you
And
very
thank you
much.
to Ma'am Herona also for
Yeah,
helping
yeah.
out. Thank you, ma'am.
Hi, I would also like to thank Dr. Jobers Versalis. I failed to mention him in the introduction. A very good friend of mine, a very, very kind fellow. I cannot forget Jobers. So thank you very much. Also, hi to Jobers. Thank you, po.
And Sir Jobers is a very cooperative and very helpful partner, actually, ng Gabi Isa Kabilin. Sir, in fact, you both will be back this December for another online
Sure.
webinar with us for Gabi Isa Kabilin. And I think everyone should watch out for that, because the two of them will be debunking myths about Lapu-Lapu. Very interesting. Thank you
That's true.
again, Dr.
Thank
Herona.
you, Heights. Thank you, Heights. Thank you, po, everyone.
And we'd like to thank the Archdiocese of Cebu, especially the Archbishop of Cebu, Archbishop Jose Palma, and for the Committee on Social Media Activities headed by Father Mar Balili, and the many Monsignor Ting. We have Father Jojo Diakino, and we have also Father Monsignor Joseph Tan, and I don't know if I've missed out anyone. But we'd also like to thank the GSK partner museums and sites for 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 the running of the GSK in general. We have to thank also the GSK organizing committee, who ensures that our webinars are running smoothly. Joey, Arlene, Martel, Sig, and Mac. The CRM group of Rafi, of which Faye is a member, and the BDG, our brand development group. We'd like to remind everyone that October 9 here in GSK, we have a video feature on Fort San Pedro. That's already next Friday. On October 23, we have Visayan myths and legends storytelling. Watch out for that. For the 500 years of Christianity, social media activities of the Archdiocese, tomorrow and succeeding Saturdays, they will now be showing brief videos. It's like a videos of the brief history of Catholicism and her mission, and that is by Father Marvin Mejia. Tomorrow we'll begin with from Jerusalem to the Roman Empire. Very interesting, a 4-part series. And if you want to get a certificate, not only do you have to register, you need to also answer our evaluation form, and which will be available after this webinar. And we would also like to, for those who have not seen our GSK activities in the past, and including this one, which is, I really recommend everyone should really listen and watch this webinar. You can check the GSK FB page. But for this particular webinar, this is also shared with the 500 years of Catholicism's at Archdiocese of Cebu FB page, because this is very enlightening, especially for our fellow Catholics. And with that, we'd like to say goodbye, everyone. Good afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of the day. God bless everyone.
Thank you so much for sharing your valuable time and for participating in our webinar. We hope to see you again next month for another engaging activity to appreciate and experience Cebu's culture and heritage. Only here at Gabi sa Kabilin 2020 online activities. Have a nice day.